Alright, so we got, I was trapped in a 30-inch oil pipe.
The powerful vortex pulled each of the 5 men into a pitch-black nightmare, with water rushing past them as tools were torn from their hands and their bodies slammed into one another. The force of these collisions were so intense that they twisted and broke bones, leaving them in excruciating pain. Trapped inside the narrow underwater pipe, their arms and legs were pinned, leaving them helpless and unable to move. All 5 men were plunged into complete darkness, submerged into a suffocating mix of water and crude oil. They were swept through the pipe, unable to see, call for help, or even open their mouths to breathe. At any moment, they could drown, their lungs straining against their ribs, desperately aching for just a single breath that could keep them alive. All 5 of the men were trapped and living their worst nightmare. They had been swallowed whole by an oil pipe, and with each passing moment, their hope for survival was dwindling. It's an incident that has since become known as the Paria diving disaster, a tragic example of gross corporate negligence and one company's flagrant disregard for the lives of its workers. And this is the story of how it all happened. February 25th, 2022 had begun as an ordinary day.
This was recent?
5 divers working for Land and Marine Contracting Services, a company specializing in marine
like
and civil
6 years ago
projects, were readying themselves for what was sure to be a long, exhausting day at work. Christopher Budram, Faisal Kurban, Kazim Ali Jr., Yusuf Henry, and Rishi Nagasar had been tasked with performing maintenance on a part of a large underwater pipeline that had ran along the seabed. This long, 30-inch wide U-shaped pipe would channel oil through it between the 2 risers on either end, once it was fully operational. The oil would be taken from the first riser, known as Berth 5, where an oil tanker would dock to unload its crude oil cargo. Then the pipe would transport the oil over to Berth 6, the second riser at the opposite end. From there, it would be sucked up and taken into the refinery located at Berth 6, where it could then be readied for further use. The Berth 6 refinery platform, located off the coast of Pointe-à-Pierre in Trinidad and Tobago, was and still is the country's largest oil refinery. At the time, the refinery was owned by the Paria Fuel Trading Company, an oil company that itself was owned and operated by the government of Trinidad and Tobago. It was Paria who was responsible for employing the Land and Marine Contracting Services, the company that sent the 5 divers to work on the Berth 6 pipeline. Diving in open water is always an extremely dangerous job. One mistake can mean the difference between life and death, but the 5-man team were prepared. Each of them was an experienced diver and felt ready for the job. As they readied their gear and prepared to head under the water to perform maintenance on the pipes, not one of them could have ever predicted what was about to happen next. The team were due to be working on a section of the pipeline that wasn't currently in use, something that should have, in theory at least, minimized the potential risk involved. In fact, in order for the necessary tasks to be carried out, the areas of the pipe that needed repairs had to be completely sectioned off from the surrounding seawater. In order to do this, the diving team needed to make use of a specialized diving bell, also referred to as a habitat. About 8 feet tall and the same in width, this inflatable cube was designed to create a dry workspace for the divers by creating a pocket of pressure that displaced the water in the area around the section of pipe that they'd be performing maintenance on. So, feeding an air tube into the bell, the divers inflated and installed the cube structure over the pipeline at Berth 6 until it was large enough to provide them with a water-free working area. With the cube ready, the team no longer had any need for their diving gear. So once inside, they removed everything and prepared the tools they needed to carry out their work on the pipe. All 5 veteran divers then began to carry out their assigned duties, as they had done hundreds, if not thousands of times before. And at first, the work was coming along well. Everything was going exactly as expected. But there was something the men didn't know, something that was about to become a very, very big problem for them. And it all had to do with the actions taken by the Paria Fuel Trading Company before maintenance had even started. Only 2 weeks prior, the company had installed an inflatable plug on the pipe itself in order to protect the oil that was being transported through it and to prevent it from leaking out and contaminating the surrounding water for the 2 weeks until the pipe could be serviced by the diving team. In the oil industry, inflatable plugs like these are called dead legs, and while their use is considered standard procedure, they come with their own fair share of dangers. These so-called dead legs should only be used after intensive planning to ensure that nothing goes wrong. And after they're installed, they need to be closely monitored for changes until more permanent repairs can be made. And those repairs can often take several days. Given the sheer amount of risk involved, the 5-man diving team couldn't be sent out to Berth 6 until after numerous discussions had taken place, detailing the planning and preparation.
Bro, please tell me they lived and got a bag off this shit, bro.
And readying for repairs of this nature can take several days, during which an active dead legs plug needs to be properly kept an eye on. Unfortunately, the Paria Fuel Trading Company hadn't done that. They wanted their pipeline fixed quickly, no matter how many safety measures they needed to circumvent in order to make that happen. The 5-man diving team were simply following the instructions given by the company higher-ups. So when they made their way down into the worksite habitat, they had no idea that such a nightmarish surprise was awaiting them. The inflatable plug affixed to the pipe was pressurized, separating the high-pressure air inside the inflatable habitat from the low-pressure air that was inside the pipeline itself. This created what's known as a latent differential pressure, or delta P. And differential pressure is the equivalent of an underwater powder keg, one that doesn't need a spark to set it off, but any change to the delicate balance of varying air pressure. As the divers worked inside the habitat, Kazim Ali Jr. handed a wrench to one of his teammates, who started to loosen the pressure valve that was keeping the plug in place. And when he opened it, that balance of air pressure was disrupted, and violently. The moment that the plug was released, the pressure difference suddenly caused everything to be sucked into the pipe. Air, water, loose equipment, and crucially, the 5 divers. The power of the pulling force was so strong that a torrent of seawater suddenly came pouring into the diving bell habitat, flooding the workspace that the men were now trapped inside. Although they wouldn't be stuck there for long, the intense pressure differential combined with a sudden flood created enough force that the divers were pulled even further down into the narrow pipe that they'd been attempting to repair. Within seconds, before any of them had a moment to process or even realize what was happening, they were being shot down into the 200-foot-long oil pipe, as if they were being sucked through a giant straw. Their bodies crashed against the sides of the narrow pipe, and they couldn't take
all over my face
breath without inhaling a disgusting mix of salty seawater and toxic crude oil. And for the men, it seemed to be never-ending. For a full minute and a half, Christopher, Faisal, Kazim, Yusuf,
a
and
full
Rishi
minute and
were
a half
violently thrown about like rag dolls inside the pipe, until finally the 5 of them came to a stop. After the rush
I don't even think I can
of
hold my
water
breath
and
for
air had
fucking
stopped
40
flinging them
seconds.
around, they'd come to settle partway down the oil pipe in an air pocket, allowing them to breathe once again, at least for the time being. But now they were faced with the grim reality of what was happening to all 5 of them. They weren't just injured and disoriented, they were trapped. But at the very least, they were still able to speak to each other. Christopher was also at the end of the chain of the trapped men, followed by Kazim, Yusuf, Rishi, and then Faisal. Once they had managed to calm each other down, the men assessed who was injured. It seemed that Christopher had sustained the fewest injuries, while the others had a mix of cuts, scrapes, and broken bones.
Damn.
Next up was figuring out how to get out of this mess.
Were they able to
Seemed
see in there at
easy, right,
least?
just to go back down the pipe the way they'd come, but there was only one problem. They didn't know which way that was. Christopher was certain that they'd all gone down the pipe head first, but the others weren't so sure. According to Kazim, Faisal, and Yusuf, they'd all gone in feet first. So, did they crawl forward head first, or shimmy back feet first? Trusting his teammates, Christopher decided they would crawl head first. So, he put his feet on Kazim's shoulders and instructed him to help pull the rest of the group in the direction they thought the exit would be. This put Faisal at the back of the line, as it were, and he was instructed to help by pushing the others forward. So, by linking themselves together in a human chain, the 5 divers began their long, treacherous journey through the pipe, hoping they would gradually crawl toward the way out. 5 of them squeezed through the narrow confines of the pipe, which was covered in thick, slippery oil residue. The sludge made it harder to push themselves along, and
Would they even be able to hold their breath for that long back all the way up?
They were forced to navigate blindly through the pitch-black, claustrophobic tunnel with no sign of any light at either end. The foul, oil-polluted air burned their throats and stung their eyes, and the excruciating pain they felt from the bruises and broken bones made the journey slow and arduous. As they made their way further through the pipe, the men prayed for a way out, or at the very least some kind of reprieve. And then an answer to their prayers came. When the men were sucked into the pipe, so too was every object in the diving bell that wasn't secured down. And they had just found the best possible thing they could hope for.
The gas mask?
2 oxygen tanks, both with their regulators still attached. Of course, only 2 meant that there was hardly enough oxygen to go around for all 5 divers. So they each instead took small sips of air from one tank at regular intervals, keeping the second as a backup. That way, each of the trapped men could keep some clean oxygen in their lungs, as a way to offset all the tainted air they were forced to breathe. However, they were quickly faced with another problem. As the men crawled along, they soon noticed something. The further they went, the higher the water level was getting. It dawned on Christopher that to keep moving forward meant that they'd soon have to pass through what was likely a completely submerged section of pipe. Considering the state that the men were in, and with only 2 oxygen tanks between them, carrying on through the next submerged section of pipe just wasn't a viable option. There was no way of telling how far the submerged section went on for, but there was almost no chance all 5 of them could make it through with the little available oxygen they had. If they tried to go as a group, they would all die. So, Christopher Boudram was faced with an impossible decision, the hardest he'd ever had to make his entire life. He told the others the conclusion he'd come to. He had to leave the others behind and continue along on his own, so he could get help for the others. The rest of the group agreed it was their only chance to escape, so they gave Christopher the second oxygen tank, and he started to crawl forward alone. But when he went to continue on, he found that something was holding on to him. It was Kazim. He was gripping at Christopher's boot and begging for him to stay. The others tried to convince Kazim that this was the only way, that if there was any chance of the others surviving, it would be by Christopher going ahead on his own. But still, Kazim wouldn't let go. Finally, Christopher was forced to yank himself free and head off alone. He crawled forward until he couldn't keep his head out of the water any longer, took a final breath, and swam into the fully submerged pipe. Still not entirely sure that he was heading in the right direction or how long the oxygen in his tank would last, Christopher swam forward, keeping the tank in.
I gotta wash my hands real quick, chat. I'll make sure I edit this out the video. Alright, my bad.
In front of him. Luckily, there were several air pockets located throughout the flooded section of the pipe, but these provided only a moment's reprieve before he was forced to continue on. Fighting against his own exhausted body and the long stretches he had to go without oxygen, he started to realize the air quality from the tank was getting worse, which only meant that it was getting closer and closer to empty. His diving instincts compelled him to keep going forward, no matter what, though. So, while still underwater, with no end to the submerged pipe in sight, he took his last breath and swam, when suddenly the now empty tank he was holding in front of him collided with something. Handed a lifeline as if by fate, Christopher had run right into another oxygen tank. He quickly scrambled to get the regulator in his mouth before his last breath could take him no further. Fumbling with the new tank in the pitch darkness, Christopher found what he was looking for, but the regulator had no mouthpiece, so instead, in desperation, he shoved the entire thing into his mouth and inhaled. It was like breathing in expired motor oil, but it still gave his lungs the oxygen he needed so badly. Unwilling to stop, Christopher summoned his remaining strength and pushed on. He had no idea how long he'd survive for, or how far he'd get. In the back of his head, he had to reckon with the very real possibility that he would not make it to safety, that he would get stuck, or his already dwindling strength would deplete, or this new tank would also run empty and he'd drown, alone in the submerged part of the pipe, leaving his 4 fellow divers to a similarly grim fate. Desperate to keep on going, Christopher pushed himself further. He knew the rest of the group were living on borrowed time as much as he was, and couldn't have been faring much better due to their injuries, and the single oxygen tank shared between the 4 of them. Clambering his way through the pipe, Christopher reached another air pocket. Moving his head above the water to catch his breath, his mind was still in survival mode, his instincts telling him that the best chance for survival was reaching the riser at the far end of the pipe. Determined, Christopher still couldn't ignore his own limitations. He was in abject danger, without any source of light or a sense of direction.
So he can't see the whole time?
And an air supply that was rapidly running out. But with his muscles aching, his throat burning from the oily residue that he'd breathed in, Christopher kept clawing himself through the slippery pipe. The next section of the pipe ahead of him was only half full of water. Finally, he could breathe again, but it would still take all of his remaining strength to make it through. Christopher found another air tank, having reached the very last flooded section of the pipe right before the riser. Then, he heard something he never expected to. Someone was calling his name. Faisal, one of the other divers, had swam up behind him.
What?
He had been following Christopher the entire time that he'd been navigating his way through the submerged portions of the pipe. Faisal urged his fellow diver to wait before entering the last flooded part ahead, but Christopher insisted there was no more time. They had all been in the pipe for too long of a time, and the already limited oxygen was running out. Believing that berth 6, the refinery side of the pipe, was waiting right on the other side of the next submerged section, Christopher elected to carry on alone, but he left Faisal with the remaining oxygen tank before he swam into the oily water. Continuing along, Christopher found the bend in the pipe that indicated he was getting close. Time to find out if he was at berth 6, where he and the team had been working, or the other side of the pipe at berth 5, the end of which was still sealed off. It was a horrifying thought. After all of this effort, he could be swimming up 60 feet only to find the plug at berth 5, blocking him from going any further, leaving him stuck
No
with
way.
to inevitably drown. Making his way upward, Christopher could no longer ignore how physically exhausted he was. As he continued swimming up, his eyes burned, his lungs ached in his ribcage, fatigue making his limbs feel like they weighed far more than they did. He kicked up toward the riser, still desperate to make it out and get help for the others. Then, after more than 2 hours in the narrow, oily-soaked confines of the pipe, Christopher emerged out of the water at the riser of berth 6. He banged and
Oh, he just
yelled,
fucking
hoping
clutched
to
up,
attract the
bro.
attention of whoever was
He
close
just
enough to
clutched up
overhear.
for his squad.
Rescuers heard him and rushed to help, offering a chain down to help lift Christopher out of the pipe. He was battered, exhausted, and much worse for wear, but he was still alive. The others, though, were still down there in the pipe. As medics rushed to help him and prepare to take him to the hospital, Christopher relayed as much info as he could. He told them the pipeline was filled with air pockets, and that the other 4 divers were still alive down there. He did his best to give their position as precisely as possible, insisting that Faisal, Kazim, Yusuf, and Rishi were injured, but still alive. Unfortunately, the rest of the Land and Marine Contracting Services didn't buy Christopher's story. They insisted that the pipeline had been filled with crude oil, and that if the others were still down there, they would likely have drowned within the first few minutes. Even when Christopher explained that they'd been able to find the oxygen tanks they'd come across, they insisted that these would only have provided the divers with a maximum of an hour's worth of air each, and it had already been over 2 hours since the pressure had pulled them inside. But at Christopher's insistence that his teammates were still alive, the Land and Marine Contracting Services sent rescue divers right down to the pipe, where they were told to knock on its surface at regular intervals. To their surprise, the divers immediately received taps in response from the inside. They had found the other divers. Inside the pipe, Faisal, Kazim, Yusuf, and Rishi were undoubtedly overwhelmed with relief to hear sounds from the outside, but they were still trapped inside the pipe with a rapidly
How would they
dwindling
even get them
supply of
out, bro?
oxygen. The ship above that had brought them to berth 6 to begin the maintenance work and had inadvertently started this whole nightmare was equipped with plenty of spare oxygen tanks, ropes, lights, and other able-bodied Land and Marine Contracting Services divers who could offer the 4 trapped men help. So having heard the taps from the outside, the remaining group waited, expecting any minute to see a glint of a lamp in the water, or hear the clang of oxygen tanks being sent down to them. The Land and Marine Contracting Services had determined their location, but what they hadn't done was figure out a way to get the 4 divers out of the pipe. But the trapped men fully expected that the Paria Fuel Trading Company and the Land and Marine Contracting Service would do everything in their power to save them. But as the hours ticked by, with the level of carbon dioxide rising, the men began to worry that their worst nightmare was coming true, and no rescue would come for them. Desperate to be saved, the 4 of them were only about 100 feet away from salvation, but still, no one came for them. Hours dragged on into days as the 4 men hanging on the pipe in terror, hoping to catch someone's attention. They even attempted to move closer to the exit of the pipe, but nothing could shift the crushing weight of the realization that came after several days spent inside the oil pipe. No one was coming to help. They were going to die down there. Witnesses, including several rescue divers, said that they could hear the sound of people's hands desperately tapping inside of the pipe for nearly a full 48 hours before the tapping eventually stopped for good. So what happened? Why, even after Christopher escaped and told them that there were still men trapped inside the pipe, were they left to simply suffocate to death in the pipeline? The action, or rather lack of action, taken by both Land and Marine Contracting Service and the Paria Fuel Trading Company has been widely debated. It's thought by some that Paria, along with their sister company Heritage, as well as the local Coast Guard, acted in such a way that actually directly hindered any rescue efforts. Some have even claimed that officials acting on behalf of Paria were intentionally preventing other divers from entering the pipe to save the 4 men trapped below. The Paria Fuel Trading Company has since asserted that there was no viable way to save the 4 men without putting the lives of the rescue divers at risk. While they have always maintained that the 4 injured men were dead and that the banging sounds were caused by air pockets inside the oil pipe, there are plenty who have refuted this. Members of the local Coast Guard, other land and marine contracting service divers, and even the family members of the 4 men who were themselves professional divers have all agreed that the 4 men were still alive on February the 25th, 2022 at around 5 o'clock, which was the time Christopher exited the pipe. Several days after the Paria diving disaster took place, the Paria Fuel Trading Company pulled the bodies of Faisal Kurban, Kazim Ali Jr., Youssef Henry, and Rishi Nagasar out of the pipe. Autopsies were carried out on 2 of them. However, coming up with a conclusive time of death for each man was impossible. It seemed that each of the men had lived until various times on Saturday, the 26th of February, although some appeared to have...
So if they were able to go in there and get the dead bodies, why were they not able to go in there and get them when they were alive? What?
have still been alive up until Monday the 28th, a full 3 days after the incident began. The autopsies couldn't provide a conclusive cause of death for the men either, with some speculating that they died as a result of their untreated injuries, or ran out of breathable air. There were suggestions that they might have even drowned by trying to swim their way toward one of the pipe exits and getting stuck in one of the submerged sections. An official commission of inquiry into the Paria diving disaster was launched in Trinidad and Tobago. During the investigation into the circumstances surrounding the disaster, Christopher Boudram would be asked to testify before the commission, sharing his disturbing experience and even providing GoPro camera footage of the horrific events. The inquiry into the Paria diving
There was
incident
GoPro footage?
that the owners of the pipeline, the Paria Fuel Trading Company, were responsible for the tragic deaths due to gross negligence on their part. The land and marine contracting services were also considered to be culpable, although they couldn't be prosecuted due to Paria being the ones responsible for prohibiting the rescue. Christopher Boudram, as the sole survivor of the disaster, was unable to return to work after his fellow divers' tragic deaths. Now go watch the most brutal, painless death in history,
What,
sunk
bro?
through a tiny hole, or the
Damn, bro. Rest in peace to those 4 guys, bro. That shit is crazy. I want to see if I can find the footage of the GoPro, bro. If I find that, best believe we reacting to it.